All right, so I've been excited to do this with you.
Thanks for having me. Very excited to be here.
Yeah, maybe it'll be good to learn more about Lux Capital. So, I mean, Lux Capital is very unique, right? So you guys invest everything from like cutting edge software to biosyntheses and, surgical robots and flying things. So it's a wide spectrum. How does the firm work, and how do you guys build conviction in such a diverse, sector and topics that you cover?
Yeah, so at Lux, we like to say we bring sci-fi to sci-fact. Yeah. So we're not afraid of investing in things that seem crazy, things that are, technical projects that are still in early stages of development, spinning IP out of research labs and universities. And I think that's important to mention because we like to say, we believe before others understand. And related to how we evaluate companies, we're not afraid of taking technical risk in a way that I think many VCs are focused on taking market risk. So I'll give kind of an example of what that means. Technical risk is I'm underwriting something based on whether or not it will work technically. So maybe a new biotech invention, maybe a new approach of open source AI, maybe a totally different approach of hardware or mechanical engineering and robotics. We have a cool company in the US called Physical Intelligence, which is kind of a software brain for robotics and a totally new software approach. Kind of founded in research out of Stanford and Berkeley and Google DeepMind. Most VCs, I would argue, take market risk. So there may be 10 companies going after the same exact market, but they are actually taking the same technical approach. It's really just in terms of how they execute. And so that's been interesting to kind of contrast where we think we can go earlier. We're a team of mostly engineers on the team. We are all generalists, but we have different passion areas. So I may have a passion area for AI and cutting edge software. My colleague may have a passion for biotech or healthcare. We work as a team, and so maybe there's a biotech company that also has AI, right? Or maybe there's a software company applied to defense, and we team up on these different deals to ultimately try to make the best decision.
And how do you feel comfortable or build the confidence that you've gone deep enough, right? Because you can go very, very deep, and you can take months or even years just to even learn the craft or the technology. But how do you get yourself comfortable in let's say like bio or some categories like that?
So it depends again on the person and their passion area. Our colleagues who invest in biotech, many of whom have a lot of experience in the space. In fact, maybe pursued or wanted to pursue PhDs in the field. My colleague Jaheen has a PhD in electrical engineering and does a lot of our chip and hardware and semiconductor investments. So we do actually have expertise on the team, which we're lucky to have there, and defer heavily to those folks in the cases of biotech as an example. However, we also have a great network of folks. So entrepreneurs in our own network, research professors at universities like Stanford University or Berkeley in the Bay Area that help us kind of get to an answer quickly. So if we're looking to diligence, we'll often bring in some of those folks to help augment, our initial research approach, and then kind of leverage that into maybe even a broader thesis. So, we may be chasing a certain thesis in AI or biotech, meaning many different companies over many months, meaning many different professors and also, technical experts in the enterprise world and in the research world to ultimately drive to, that best hypothesis on what that company should be. And one thing I should mention is we do also new company formations, so incubations. So that means we are actually actively researching a thesis and trying to find a company that fits that. And I'll give two examples. One, which is very relevant to Japan, is a company called Kurion. Kurion was actually a result of a Lux kind of deep dive research thesis into nuclear. And we were looking at nuclear energy. It was the era, this is over 10 years ago now, where there was a lot of exciting investment in the space, and yet there wasn't really it wasn't clear to us what was the right venture bet was. So we kind of went where everyone else was not talking about, the more contrarian viewpoint, which was nuclear waste. Instead of everyone talking about energy, we're looking at the opposite of what is the natural outcome of producing all this energy. So created a company called Kurion, kind of brought the founding team and founding investors together, owned a meaningful portion of the company. And then, unfortunately, when the Fukushima disaster happened here, this company, Kurion, was the only international company chosen to help clean up. The disaster was sold to Veolia for over a 30x, a few years later. And so that's a great example of very thesis driven,
Yeah.
bringing together the right folks around the table, and then ultimately, serving a positive, end outcome. Another one is a company called Osmo, and they're a company based in New York.
Okay.
We had a long thesis, and we still do in some ways on, anthropomorphizing AI, right? So how do you give AI not just a voice or, the vision, but the sense of smell. And so we've digitized so many of our other senses. You can speak into your smartphone as an example, or you can even have haptic feedback. But what is like that anthropomorphized technology of smell? So we looked at probably hundreds of companies across the space, and we found it as a company called Osmo. They spun out of Google Brain in Boston, and they are actually like digitizing smell. So what does that mean? They can identify the molecules that we're sitting in this room right now, and then actually recreate those using their scent machine.
Wow.
And so that was one where there was a founding, CEO, but we helped get, a lot of the founding investors together, seeded it with the first capital, and they actually have their first kind of scent, how would I describe it? Kind of like a scent machine that is transpired online. So those are two kind of examples of the Lux thesis as it comes to incubation and not being afraid to bet on early ideas that are, people driven or thesis driven from the early stages.
Wow. I mean, that scent startup sounds really like science fiction. I mean, and with the nuclear waste company, so you've built the thesis before the Fukushima event, or was
Correct.
it after?
It was before. We invested several years before. And it gets back to even take AI today, right? So we like to say, again, we believe before others understand. Our first investment at Lux in AI was in 2013. That we're sitting in 2025 today, so that was 12 years ago. And that investment, in fact, was even too early. But a majority of our AI investments are in companies like Hugging Face, the GitHub for machine learning. We led the Series A in 2019, so 6 years ago. Runway, generative AI for video creation. I know they have a great user base here in Japan. That was in 2018, actually. Spun out of NYU's research lab, actually. Mosaic ML, they actually were sold to Databricks for 1.3 billion a few years ago. And think of them as kind of like a platform to train kind of AI models in the early days. And so those are early companies where we were able to partner early, in part, we would argue because of our technical insight, to believe before others thought they were going to be, as big outcomes as they were. And now, in some cases they're exited or they're all sitting at, multi-billion-dollar valuations today.
Do you also evaluate the founder, whether or not that he or she can run the business or expand and execute the business once that technical risk is sort of mitigated?
100%. I often talk, and several mentors of mine have mentioned this in the past, you have to bet on the jockey, not the horse. And so much is, who is running the ship. And in many cases with those incubations, we're laser focused on getting that right person, right? Sometimes the academic founder or the research leader is not the right CEO to lead that company commercially. So we spend a lot of our time finding that CEO and that right early stage founder, helping them get the team of executives around them successful. But both are important in tandem, and particularly the early stage. So much is dependent upon that CEO or that leader's ability to be able to kind of bring that science fiction to life, whether in terms of kind of their visionary recruiting, their ability to really, take in many cases what is just a few pieces of paper, right, to begin with, and turn that into really transformative technology.
Last question about Lux Capital. So you told me that you do check sizes from $100K to all the way $100 million. And then I guess if you multiply that with bio and AI and all these different topics, it seems like it's a very hard process to make a decision. How does the investment committee work? Like, how do you guys make a decision?
So I think about our fund in kind of like a seed fund, a Series A fund, and then an opportunity fund all smushed into one. So it's a 1.2 bill roughly USD vehicle today. Think of that as, the smaller the check, the faster it is to a decision. And so, we have a few different programs where with a smaller check, it's really on the individual partner to get it done. For a majority of our core positions, so that larger check size, we have a voting committee. And so everyone does vote on deals, and roughly, we really focus on, getting consensus across our team, and using our team as thought partners to leverage, what are the existing, diligence items we need to get done? What are the things we want to double click on? before we make a final decision. So again, it requires a high degree of trust in your teammates and also trust of their different passion areas and of the diligence and work they've done. And that, to me, is what creates a great partnership, is where you kind of challenge each other with different contrarian views, but you can also, count on each other for the work they've done to kind of get to the best outcome.
Wow. How many partners do you have?
We're 9 on the investing team.
9. Wow. And you need everyone's vote to, let's say, for the larger checks. Or majority. Interesting. That's a really fascinating process. I would love to sit down in one of your IC meetings and talking about sci-fi and all these things. It must be a lot of fun. So let's talk about AI, because since that's the sort of the bulk of our conversation, and specifically the application layer of AI, because we believe that in Japan that there's going to be a lot of opportunities for investing in the application layer, especially in AI. But what are sort of the key characteristics that you look for when investing in a AI application company specifically? And sort of what separates the ones that get funded from you and the ones that don't?
So I gave a presentation recently at the AI Engineer Summit in New York, and one of the kind of key points I made was UX, or user experience, is the moat that matters. So that's probably the number one thing I'm looking for in any AI application. So it's an understanding of the user workflow. So maybe let's use a simple example in coding today. An area most people know. Cursor is a pretty well-known company in that space. They know the user workflow of a developer or a coder very well. They've thought about their psyche. They've thought about how they're using every interaction. They are developers themselves. So really understanding that user workflow at a fundamental level. So one is that. 2 is being able to integrate with all your systems. So really strong product integrations to make that user workflow successful. So, plugging into your code base or your IDE or everything you need to be able to seamlessly switch into that, Cursor IDE as an example. And then 3rd, almost delighting the user, because you can integrate so beautifully with the workflow. So how can you create amazing product innovations that are, hitting tab to actually write a new line of code in a way that is seamless, that fits into that workflow and creates that, magical experience of, wow, I can code so much faster because of it. So that combination of things is what I really look for. It really comes down to a really clear understanding of the user, and then also really strong product thinking and product building abilities to not just, integrate with all the systems, but then turn that and the beauty of large language models into, a really unique or creative experience.
So I guess in a sense, when you sort of evaluate these companies, you don't really, I guess, look at what LLMs they use, or if they have proprietary LLMs or those kind of things. It's more just sort of the user experience, integrations, the workflows, and the understanding of customers.
So I would say it's interesting, because my opinion on that has changed, right? Okay. I would say back in 2022, when GPT-4 had just come out, I feel like it was kind of this moment of, oh, interesting, is there any tech moat, right? Like, what is the technical moat for a net new AI application? I think since then we've seen, a lot of amazing, open source large language models come out, like Meta's Llama models, and you're realizing, oh wow, these models, you can do the same thing a lot cheaper, and in many ways it's democratized. More recently, we've seen a lot of the DeepSeek models be really performant, and so we've always believed, with some of our open source investment, that open source and closed source gap is closing. In fact, I think it was just accelerated probably by the model shipment of these incredible research labs. And so when that happens, the model is no moat, right? And so I think what's important is AI application companies that can adapt very quickly to the next new model, to the next Anthropic model, to the next OpenAI model, but not necessarily that the company has their own model in itself, right? So what is their unique approach? How do they do more with less? And then how do they ultimately build that great user experience adapting to those models underneath?
And what ends up becoming moats for these businesses? What do you believe are sort of key things that companies should build over time, especially to make sure that they have the competitive advantage and that they can maintain their moat?
I think a lot of it is similar to SaaS in many ways, where it's a lot about your execution, how well you can outcompete your competitors. It's a lot about your data. So the proprietary data you have, also the data you're collecting to create a better and better product experience, and then ultimately about really, really good execution, right? So how do you measure all those things in tandem and then create a fantastic user experience? I think there's probably less technical moat than maybe the media or the public opinion is thinking about today, and much more of an impetus on innovative product thinking. So I still think we haven't seen enough innovative product experiences in AI just yet. So not just interfacing, about the chatbot, but actually leveraging AI in totally new and different ways.
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree. And you mentioned proprietary data, and it's definitely mentioned as one of the moats for software business in the AI world. But what are the characteristics of good proprietary data and versus the bad one, I guess? Yeah.
So it's an interesting question because there's so many different types of data, right? I think good data is data that you can leverage and use. And so, I don't think any data is necessarily bad. It just may not be in a good form to use. You might need to clean it, or you might need to actually kind of get it in the right shape to then put into your own AI system. I think when you think about data, though, there's a few different types, right? Yes, there's one proprietary data. So your own data, maybe from your data warehouse, your own data in your manufacturing facility, what data you have that no one else has. Second, there's data that the AI model produces. So we've seen the rise of these really cool reasoning models, right? Where you can actually self-reflect. So the model can actually learn and create its own data on understanding, okay, this was the right answer or the wrong answer. I'm going to now reason my way out of the situation, self-reflect, and do a different path. So actually collecting that data too is really interesting, and I'm hopeful that a lot of startups will continue to do that. So I don't just have my own proprietary data, but I'm getting smarter and smarter each time as I run that AI agent or that AI model in production. And then third is how this all comes together. So kind of AI in your model workflow, all the different kind of signals. So we talk a lot about evaluations in machine learning or evals. So, how do you make sure that the model is saying the right thing or the correct answer? That's super easy in things like math and science where there's very clear yes or no answers. The math problem is correct, the science problem is correct or not correct. It gets much harder in these non-verifiable domains. So is this a good English essay or not? Deep research, right? Is this a good research report based on my preferences as a venture capitalist? Those are much more subjective. And so then creating good evaluation frameworks and data. So maybe the more I use deep research from OpenAI, it learns, okay, Grace is really good, really likes this type of research report. And we're collecting that signal on the questions I'm asking so we can get better and better over time. So data and data curation is critical. I think we're still very early in tapping into it. And I think it's always been important in the world of kind of software that data is a big moat. And I think it will continue to be, particularly the later two categories I mentioned, over time.
So you gave a presentation the other day. So you talked about how AI agents are working effectively yet, right? And then you used the example of flight booking. But what can you mention what key breakthroughs do we need for agents to become practically useful? Yeah.
So we're at a perfect storm right now, I think, and I think a lot of folks have been talking about, okay, 2025 is the year of the AI agent, right? We had a lot of the foundational AI built. Now we're seeing AI applications start to be built, and AI agents should happen, right? And why? We've seen the rise of reasoning models that we just talked about. So DeepSeek's R1, OpenAI's O1 and O3. We've seen the rise of test time compute training method, right, to put more compute at inference time, and that leads to some really exciting capabilities. We've seen, rise of hardware efficiency and engineering efficiency, using different types of chips. DeepSeek's, R1 model was a feat of really great engineering efficiency, using very little money to actually create a great model. And then, of course, tons of infrastructure spend and build up, right? In the US, we had this thing called Stargate, $500 billion investment project. When I was in Japan in November, NVIDIA and SoftBank announced that massive, data center partnership as well. And in Europe, Macron announced that over $100 billion package. So perfect storm of, wow, we got the compute, we got the models, AI agents should be working. In reality, I think the technology is pretty close, right? And so I don't think we necessarily need a net new crazy research breakthrough. I think it's about how do we actually leverage the tools we have better, right? And how do we actually leverage the net new model improvement and make it work? It was basically booking a flight seems simple, right? It was a flight from New York to San Francisco. Say a flight from New York to Japan, right? I like to fly out of a specific airport in New York. I want to fly in a specific airline because of my airline points to get upgraded. I have budget requirements. I also have traffic requirements. And so those are things where the technology could understand, the stated preference that Grace prefers Haneda to Narita. It could understand how to search the web, but doing all those things together is what's hard. So if you think almost like baking a cake or a cooking analogy, it's how do you kind of get all those ingredients in the right proportion, working in tandem. And so that's the real issue we're seeing is like these small errors that compound over time. And so a simple agent that should work in tandem can actually be complex in theory because of all these little compounding agents and how you make them work together.
Does that also mean that in the future it'll be a better experience to work with this one agent doing a longer and larger workflow than having multiple agents sort of talk to each other to, I guess, accomplish one mission or one task?
Not necessarily. I think both will happen, right? I think in many ways today, a lot of agentic workflows are, AI agents calling themselves for each task. And I've seen some cool AI applications using swarms of agents, for more simplistic individual tasks. I think the short answer is we'll probably see a mixture of the two. It depends a little bit on access to data and how the breadth, I think, of the AI solution versus the depth, and probably also your cost and latency requirements. My guess is, a lot of smaller agents doing little tasks are a lot cheaper than one big agent running a massive, test time compute reasoning model across, your whole database or system.
Interesting. And you've mentioned sort of the 5 strategies for mitigating the error for AI. Correct me if I'm wrong in any of these. So you said data curation, evals, scaffolding, UX, and multimodality. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Which of these do you think is most overlooked by the startups that you work with or the founders that you meet?
Yeah, I think multimodality is the one that I'm really excited about. I think it's also really exciting for Japan. As I think about, the cool voice startups here, computer vision startups here, a lot of the really cool robotics companies, I think of Japan. But I think what I mean by that is if you go back to that flight example, I think we have these almost imperfect human expectations of AI today. We think AI is going to snap our fingers and the flight will be booked perfectly. But in reality, as we talk about, there's a lot of complex issues happening. And so yes, you can scaffold it. Yes, you can get the right data. But ultimately, how do you reimagine these user experiences by creating an AI that looks like nothing else maybe you've seen before? So maybe even if the AI is not perfect all the time, it's such a cool user experience. It's such a cool way of interacting with the technology in a way I haven't seen before that I'm going to keep using it. What are these cool new ways of interacting with technology that's a delight to the user? So I'll give kind of a simple example from our portfolio. It's a company called TL Draw. It's like an open source canvas. So think of it as, if you're familiar with Miro, the whiteboard company, it's kind of like that. But it's kind of LLM powered and built on the ground up as an open source library as well. What's cool about that is you interact with AI without knowing you're interacting with AI. So you can create something on this product they have called TL Draw Computer, where you can actually bring together different photos and actually mix them. And there's AI working on the background. They're actually calling, a lot of Google Gemini models, but they're able to push things together and then create a recipe, based on 5 pictures I have. And there's a lot of simple examples where it's a joy to use, but there's actually not a clear chatbot interface of me calling a large language model. So that's a simple example in kind of design. I think a lot about robotics as well. So how do we create a sense of touch that is more human, right? Robotics inventions are getting better and better. I mentioned physical intelligence earlier, that great company, where I think we're having this exciting watershed moment for robotics, where we're collecting more data and we're actually able to interact with robots in a way that feels more human. Already we have robots all over Japan. I see them often, as receptionists when I go to offices, but how do we make that receptionist even better and even more empathetic in a way that we haven't even, experienced before? And then I think sound and voice, right? I've seen a lot of startups here in Japan that are doing an incredible job on that. We're still very early in kind of voice penetration. And so how do we actually create those amazing experiences where, again, you don't even know you're interacting with AI. The voice is so human-like, and also, really, really performant, low latency. A lot of those things we just haven't seen yet. The technology's early, but I'm really excited to see that, with startups in the coming few years.
Some people say this year's the year of AI agents. I mean, do you believe in that statement, or you think we're a little too early, or maybe is it next year, or what do you feel about that?
I think AI agents are really close. I'm hopeful they're here. It's always a little bit hard to judge exactly the right date, but I think we're close. And I do think you're going to continue to see incredible kind of AI agent companies or agentic workflow companies happening. Maybe one way of thinking about it is, instead of AI agents happening overnight, it's a bit more incremental. So think of AI agents or AI applications being co-pilots today, where they're maybe helping, back to that flight example, helping you book small parts of your travel itinerary, but not doing everything end to end, where the human still is in the loop a bit more. I think we're going to get to the point where more and more of those things can be done by the AI agent, less of the things than the human. So it's not an 100-0 where the AI is doing everything and the human's doing nothing, but it's maybe an 80-20. So I think that's very realistic this year. I think it's also more realistic for certain verticals than others. So things back to what we talked about with evals and evaluations, verifiable things. So coding, I think, we're actually doing very well. I think we're very close to, full end-to-end AI agents working performantly. Sales and customer support, where there's more repeatable data troves, also, getting there. I think it's taking a little bit longer for some of those non-verifiable things, particularly where there's a lot of, human-to-human interaction. If you think about, things in healthcare or financial services, the full end-to-end automation will probably be hard for a few years.
You stated somewhere that you ask founders for their 10x differentiator when they present and build their products. But what are some examples of like compelling 10x differentiators from the startups that you've met or worked with?
And that's something interesting that I don't think I really internalized till I was in venture for a few years, where you often look for well-rounded founders, right? Someone who, went to a great university and then did a great job and then ended up at a great job, and it's kind of a well-rounded CEO. I think that's, less of the case for some of the best companies I've worked with, right? So it could be as simple as a skill. You're the 10x best engineer. You're a really amazing coder and you can, ship code really quickly. A 10x salesperson, you're very charismatic. You're very good at selling your way into selling a customer or selling, a future candidate. 10x in terms of, empathy and human skills, right? You're really able to understand people and how to motivate people, incentivize people. There's a lot of others you could also think about in terms of, how they interact or kind of the chip on their shoulder. Josh on our team has a saying, chips on shoulders, but chips in pockets. So we often look for people who have something to prove, who have a lot of ambition, right? And they're, maybe 10x more motivated, to put it in that way, where they feel maybe that they were undervalued in the past and they're really excited to, prove everyone else wrong. So that's another maybe example you wouldn't think about. I think the bigger point is the venture industry is a power law industry. Starting a company and creating a unicorn company or $10 billion company is a very hard journey. And so we need out-of-distribution people in order to create out-of-distribution outcomes, right? And so that's what I really think about with that comment is what is that person's spike? And then how do you actually leverage that? Ideally, that spike leads to founder market fit. So maybe it's a 10x engineer doing a coding startup, great. Or maybe it's a 10x salesperson doing something that requires a lot of key go-to-market discussions with senior enterprise leaders. Ideally, that fit also happens across the two.
That makes total sense. So there's a lot of sort of soft factors like, that person's skill and I guess motivation, as well as I guess the market dynamics or the market that they're going after. Is there a fit there? And so that's also sort of part of deciding whether or not there's differentiation or not.
But the key point there is 10x doesn't mean well-rounded. It means spiky. And so even in references of the founders, it's like really trying to find that spike and being actually okay as the investor that maybe they're not, perfectly good engineer if they're a good salesperson, or they're not the best salesperson if they're a great engineer. That, in my experience, is probably the better way to evaluate, potential CEO.
Interesting. And since, we're All-Star SaaS Fund, we have to talk about SaaS. So there's been some tweets that some have claimed that SaaS is dead in the AI world. Which elements of traditional SaaS do you believe is actually fading out, and which do you think will prevail over time?
So I think it's not SaaS is dying, it's just SaaS is reinventing itself, right? And we talked a little bit about it earlier, but I do think AI applications are the new SaaS. And a lot of the similarities are there in terms of, access to internet, this watershed moment, access to large language models. I think the cost curve is coming down very quickly, which is great, which means there's going to be more and more, amazing new AI apps. If I think about kind of comparing and contrasting, I think there's a lot of similarities. I think execution really matters. So I think of like Ramp in our portfolio, their next gen expense management, right? They just executed their competitors. They have an amazing engineering team working really quickly. There's no real clear, tech differentiator outside of an amazing engineering team in a very crowded market of competitors. So really looking for fantastic execution, really looking for great product builders. I think both are true for a good SaaS product and a great AI application. Both really good at understanding that user workflow and experience, and then both being able to adapt to new technology really quickly. So I think they're more similar than most people think. The one thing that is different, though, is business model. I think a lot of people think of the traditional SaaS model, right? The seat-based model or the tier-based model. I do think AI is turning a lot of conventional business models on its head. And so something for founders to think about is back to that, like knowing your customer, really value-aligned pricing. So I've seen a lot of outcomes-based pricing. So based on how I resolve a customer support ticket or how I resolve lines of code, I actually, price according to that. I've also seen, consumption-based pricing of, based on the number of credits you use, you get more and more. And so I do think that is a totally different paradigm, has potential to really disrupt, old school SaaS companies, and maybe that's a little bit related to some of the Twitter sphere, and it's a great opportunity to me if you're a disruptive, startup, to rethink the business model and rethink your pricing strategy in a way that's aligned with your customers, and you have the power to do that in the way that maybe your incumbent in the category does not.
Interesting. And over time, how do you think sort of the market will evolve? So, with SaaS, when sort of SaaS sort of proliferated, like every company was using 80 or 100 different SaaS products, and then there was a moment of consolidation, right? The customers are using less and less SaaS products and trying to put it under one vendor. With that movement, will we see similar sort of trends in AI world, or do you think that proliferation would be different?
It's hard to know, but probably. I think one thing we'll probably see is kind of consolidation with some of the incumbents. So if you're a really big company, take a Salesforce as an example, you might try to augment your suite of tools by making, an acquisition or two. And I think, at least in the US, we started to see the M&A markets open up again. Another example maybe is CoreWeave. Their listed IPO, they acquired a company called Weights and Biases. So CoreWeave is more on the infrastructure compute. They're acquiring a cloud AI company. So other strategic assets, I think you're going to see more and more of that. On the other side, I do think it's, the best product will win. And I do think some of these amazing revenue ramps are unsustainable unless you're able to build a great product or expand around that. So I think you'll see some AI startups flame out. I think we saw the same thing in SaaS for the most part. You'll see some consolidation there. And then you'll see a little bit of probably a messy middle where it's kind of unclear where the category is going, and will take a little bit of time to really, get successful to that end outcome.
And beyond the application layer, is there a layer that you find really interesting, like especially after we see more and more of these sort of application layer AI companies? Where do you think there's going to be more opportunities sort of emerging?
Well, I kind of classify them as AI applications, but I think they're a little bit different, which is really AI in the physical world. So I think we talk a lot about AI in terms of text, in terms of video, in terms of, audio, and so, those more simpler forms. We talk a lot less about AI in the physical world. So what I mean by that is actually integrating with hardware, integrating with a manufacturing facility or warehouse, integrating with a robot, right? How do you actually run AI on smaller devices or edge computing? So I think that's an area where if AI is early, a lot of these areas are still very early too, where it requires proprietary data, also proprietary knowledge, not just of the workflow, but of how to work with these machines and systems, which can be a great differentiator for a startup. And then ultimately, rethinking maybe how you interact with that product based on the ability to leverage large language models. So I'm really excited about that as well. And that requires, a lot of sophisticated engineering from the bottom to the top.
Do you think these are going to be sort of vertically integrated companies, so they would do everything from hardware to the software, or do you think hardware will become a little bit more sort of, not open source, but will be more swappable, I guess, with software?
It depends on the vertical there. I think some of these, if you think about like a manufacturing warehouse, very hard to swap anything out. If you think about a robotic arm, a lot easier to swap some things out. So it is heterogeneous. I think it depends on the vertical. I think what matters a lot more is there, a tech innovation or a reason for that hardware to exist, right? And so Obviously, maybe the bigger the hardware is, generally the harder it is to replicate or change. And then how do you actually seamlessly integrate into that workflow? And so in some cases, we've seen some of our hardware companies have to rebuild the software stack because the existing solutions are too, dated. But in other situations, maybe the software is at the level of the hardware and that hardware is very interchangeable. So it really depends, comes back to knowing your customer well and kind of where that industry is at, and then adapting to leverage those models in the best way you can.
I have to ask you about Sakana. So what did you find very attractive about the company, and what was sort of the thesis or the conviction around the business that made you feel like you had to make the investment?
So Sakana really stood out because of its team. Amazing founding team, all of whom had really complementary skill sets. The combination of those three was what got us really, really excited. In addition to that, we thought two things. One, there's an opportunity to create a state-of-the-art research lab in Tokyo, and maybe the DeepMind for Asia. And just as DeepMind kind of created this amazing hub in London, could Sakana do the same for Japan and bring state-of-the-art researchers here? In a world where we've seen amazing Chinese models, amazing US models, how do we create kind of a Japanese sovereign AI that is really the core center that can power a lot of these fantastic Japanese corporations. Fully Japanese entity, majority of the team is Japanese or Japanese speaking, and really investing in the incredible Japanese economy here. Third or fourth largest economy, depending on how you cut it, right? And second largest enterprise software market. A lot of opportunity to really just be an amazing Japanese company. The second thesis, which is to me in some ways really exciting one too, is pioneering totally new ways of technology. So for those who haven't heard about what Sakana does, they leverage evolutionary algorithms, so algorithms that mimic nature. So how bees swarm in a hive, right, or how a plant grows. And they leverage these smaller agent-based models that work together to power a lot of really cool, innovative applications. I think there's potential there for them to create totally new paradigms that actually may be, a new breakthrough research innovation that doesn't just power Japan, of course they always will, but powers many other markets throughout the world. And so that gets me really excited, where I think we would have invested in this team no matter if they were in Japan or they were elsewhere, but we were really excited about the different technical approach they were taking, and of course the fact that they were targeting this incredible market in Japan.
Awesome. And so there was some discussion on Twitter about what Sakana has published. Would love to hear just your comment and sort of your reaction around that.
Yeah, so as we mentioned, right, Sakana is a disruptive company, and I think they will continue to be. And what I really credit David and the team for is pushing the limits. And they're pushing things that folks had never seen, right? Like a fully generated AI paper that's submitted to iClear, and not being afraid to do things that are unconventional or haven't been seen before. Like any of our companies, turning sci-fi to sci-fact, that will result in I think disagreement and disruption and debate. And I think that healthy debate is important to kind of push the industry forward. What's really important for me and for Sakana too, I believe, is continuing to grow the open source ecosystem. So to be transparent with all their innovation, and also be transparent with the models and technology they're publishing. So I think that will continue to be the case, and I'm really excited for their next launch.
Awesome. And let's talk about model commoditization. So, I mean, a lot of people say foundation models will be commoditized. First of all, do you believe in that statement? And if so, where would be sort of the defensible value creation in AI?
It's a good question. I do think foundation models are probably the fastest depreciating asset class on the market right now, for all the reasons we talked about earlier, right? The rise of open source models, the open source closed source gap is closing. It's much cheaper in a positive way for the ecosystem to build and develop these tools. I don't think that means, though, that AI value is going to zero. I think there's a distinction, right? I think it means if you think about the foundation, or similar to the early days of the web or even like telcos, maybe everyone has access to phone calls, or everyone has access to the web, and that kind of marginal cost goes to zero, but the value is what you build on top. So the AI applications, the product and the workflow, knowing my user behavior really, really well. And I think we're still a far away from any of that getting commoditized. I think there's a whole nother conversation, which we might need to do another podcast for, on when you see, coding everywhere, or when you see AI writing everywhere, what is the marginal cost you're willing to pay, right? I still feel like there's enough vertical product differentiation for a lot of these things, and kind of value add, that won't happen for a little while.
Yeah.
But I think that's another conversation we might be having 5 years from now on where, SaaS 2.0 becomes SaaS 3.0 and AI applications kind of disrupt themselves.
Do you think the average price of software will change because of that?
Probably. I think the whole business model is changing, right? I think it's going to be priced in ways that are more incentive aligned with the user. And I think we'll see totally different types of business models. I don't know if on the net, I'm hoping it'll be cheaper. I could also see a kind of a barbell distribution or some, really, expensive high compute products versus, less intensive, less compute products. But I do think the directional area of progress we've always seen is that gets cheaper and cheaper once the new technology is born. And then it's really what you're building around it to make it successful.
Interesting. And you mentioned about the role of open source. Slightly different, I guess, angle of question, but how do you see businesses build business around like open source projects like Hugging Face and like what do you think are like good sort of monetization strategies around that?
Well, I think open source has always been like a great business model. Actually, it's unconventional, right? It's not traditional SaaS, but since the earliest days of like the Linux movement and kind of the foundations of open source technology, you monetize in different ways, right? You might have a freemium model. You might have revenue partnerships with a lot of the cloud providers, for example. You may have, enterprise private plans, right? Where they have their own, hub and paying licenses. So open source, I still view as kind of a lead gen for many other projects. But if you can get a big enough community using your technology, you have a lot of leverage on what you can build around that.
Do you feel that there's going to be more of these sort of open source driven sort of business models over time, or do you think that's going to change?
I think open source driven is an interesting way of framing it. I do think there'll be more applications and companies built because of the underlying open source model. So open source driven in that sense of we can deliver an amazing AI technology for much cheaper because of kind of the open source model. I think open source technology has and I think will continue to be a thing. It may just be in different areas or different spaces. So it could be, of course, in new AI models. It could be in like a totally new way of interacting with technology, right? From an open source perspective outside of AI. So yes, I think open source will continue to be the same. I do think we're seeing it be a dominant underlying foundation for large language models today. And
I guess my closing question, what advice would you give to founders building in AI companies today? And how should they think about building companies right now, especially given that the dynamics are changing every day, technology is changing every day, and it's being much harder to navigate through these changes?
So I would definitely encourage people to start a company because I think the time is now, and there's a lot of exciting, kind of convergence of different inflection points. Focus on your customer, as always. That advice hasn't changed, over the last probably 10, 20 years of venture. Build a product that they want. Also build a product that is visionary and imaginative, based on knowing that customer really, really well. And then have a flexible tech stack. So know that the technology is always changing. Don't overfit any one model. Build an infrastructure and hopefully an engineering team that is really quick to evolve and adapt to the next new model. And I think it's just an exciting time. So to me, I would highly encourage everyone to get started.
Thank you so much for your time. This has been really wonderful and had a lot of fun having this conversation.
Thanks for having me. It was great.
Yeah, thank you.